Today's anomaly is about the wild life of Zdzisław Najmrodzki, a Polish man who became famous for stealing over 100 cars back in the 1980s, and the many inventive ways he escaped custody whenever caught by law enforcement. Growing up in communist Poland, Mr. Najmrodzki became a legendary figure in the media, one whose escapades captured the imagination of the people while infuriating the government, mostly because of how inept he made them look. Though he had a prolific criminal career, what made him so popular was his personal rule of only stealing from the privileged elite, avoiding physical violence at all costs. Zdzisław Najmrodzki's story begins in 1954. Born as one of 4 boys in a south-central Polish village, he found schooling difficult because of his family's tendency to move around a lot. Making matters worse, his father left when he was quite young. Mr. Najmrodzki thus developed a special attachment to his mother Sabina that lasted his whole life long. As a boy, he almost drowned at a nearby reservoir, leaving him with a noticeable lisp that his peers picked on him for. Such cruel mockery led to Sabina pulling him from school in the 5th grade, the first of many times she'd proved she'd do anything to protect her boy. Sometime later, Mr. Najmrodzki enrolled in a school for auto mechanics, where he developed a love of fast cars that would define the rest of his life. He received his certification a few years thereafter. Like most young men his age, Mr. Najmrodzki was drafted into the Polish People's Army in 1973. During his 2-year stint, he was recognized for his physical prowess and skills as a grenadier. Winning the favor of his commanding officers, Mr. Najmrodzki was afforded more freedom than the average Polish soldier. He could come and go from his unit as he pleased, without needing to wear the uniform in public. Unfortunately, a change in the type of grenades used by the armed forces left him with a shoulder injury which impacted his ability to do powerlifting. He was nevertheless offered a position in their special forces, conditional on a test where he'd have to clandestinely move from the city his unit was stationed in to go visit his family. This proved especially dangerous. Mr. Najmrodzki was warned that if he was caught by the Polish Internal Military Service, he would be arraigned on charges of desertion. Though very nearly caught, he managed to elude his pursuers by hopping onto a train at the last moment. Despite these successes, Mr. Najmrodzki turned down the special invitation to chase his dream of becoming a rally driver. Yet, according to legend, the man never even got his driver's license. Refining his skills as an escape artist would come in very handy down the road though, once Mr. Najmrodzki began carving out a less legal path for his future. For now, though, he found work as a mechanic in an auto garage in the city of Gliwice, settling down and taking a wife. Mr. Najmrodzki's first brush with law enforcement happened in 1977, after he apparently assaulted a police officer. Though he claimed he was merely practicing self-defense against a belligerent, drunken cop, the court sided with the police and Mr. Najmrodzki was given 18 months behind bars. This injustice gave him new resolve. If he was going to be treated like a criminal, he may as well enjoy the spoils of being one. He made good use of his time in the clink, refining his mechanic skills, working on cars in the prison workshop. Mr. Najmrodzki had no intention of serving his full sentence, though. A few weeks into his stay, he and a fellow prisoner were on the train to Warsaw to offer testimony. Despite his previous encounters with police, Mr. Najmrodzki got friendly with the 2 officers assigned to him, joking around and even convincing them to take off his handcuffs so the party could enjoy a couple of beers and some smokes. The train car would get awful stuffy if someone didn't open the window, so of course, one of the officers did exactly that while the merriment continued. After the guards passed out, Mr. Najmrodzki and his companion jumped out of the slow-moving train and were on the lam. He made his way back to Gliwice, hiding out with sympathetic friends. Naturally, being an escaped convict brought him few job opportunities. Mr. Najmrodzki rang up a friend from the military who he knew did side work as a smuggler. His old army buddy had the perfect job for him, creating a distraction so a convoy of trucks hauling jeans could pass through unimpeded. For this, he was given a Fiat 131, a fancy car by communist Poland standards, and told to drive like a maniac. Mr. Najmrodzki cheerfully abided. His success was handsomely rewarded, and he continued to pull off lucrative jobs bringing the people of Soviet Europe all types of Western contraband. Mostly mundane things to be sure, but immensely valuable goods to the downtrodden. Though he did well with this smuggling operation, Mr. Najmrodzki wanted to go independent. Ever the fearless and inventive type, he built his own criminal network to begin plotting different schemes to get rich. Early on, Mr. Najmrodzki targeted a Polish retail chain called Pewix. These shops carried exotic and delightful goods not commonly found in the communist side of the world, and only accepted the stable US dollar for payments. It's thought that Mr. Najmrodzki targeted upwards of 70 Pewix stores, employing a system of his own design called the poster method to do so. The poster method involved cutting a hole into the store on the outside, then having a coordinated team sneak through to plunder. A sentry would cover the hole with a poster and stay on lookout. Aiding this was the fact that Pewix stores rarely had security alarms installed, making such thefts as easy as shooting fish in a barrel. These commodities were then sold to smaller shops owned locally, giving the average man a shot at buying rare goods like jewelry and Mars bars. Mr. Najmrodzki and his team went all around Poland for over a year, striking the Pewix stores farthest away from police stations. He quickly became revered in the underground, and law enforcement was frustrated by his wily knack for constantly eluding them. But his luck wouldn't last forever. By 1980, Mr. Najmrodzki took on the nickname Szaszłyk, a corruption of his favorite meal based on how he pronounced the word with a speech impediment. He had become immensely wealthy, flaunting his success by wearing gold chains and bespoke suits. Our protagonist now lived in expensive hotels, attending the finest social events. He even mingled with certain high-ranking party officials despite his infamy. His penchant for heavy drinking would be his undoing, though. He got into it with a waiter after having a few too many, complaining about the quality of service he was given. The enraged server thus ratted him out to law enforcement. The officers came to follow up on the tip, and quite soon they had their man. Daring as he was, Mr. Najmrodzki was not about to go down without a fight. But he knew he'd have to play it smart. Direct confrontation would only hinder efforts to get away. Waiting until one of the arresting officers took a smoke break, he bolted across the street and jumped into a nearby river, managing to swim across to freedom. Law enforcement couldn't keep up. Mr. Najmrodzki hatched an escape plan that involved fleeing to Austria through Czechoslovakia. He roped his dear mother into his plans, going on the run for 2 weeks and only stopping once they were detained by guards at the border. Now in custody, Mr. Najmrodzki arranged to have the same lawyer who represented him in 1974 brought on board to try and get him out of trouble. The first part of the plan was arranging to have him brought to the jailhouse in Gliwice. Mr. Najmrodzki had the blueprints of the jail smuggled out by writing down directions on a piece of paper, including the room where prisoners awaiting trial were held. He put the plans in the window of his cell, where his associates could read them from afar using binoculars. The bars on the windows were then partially sawed off by Mr. Najmrodzki's men on the outside, and in broad daylight he was able to push them out and slide through the window to freedom. His daring escape made him the top of the headlines in Poland, and of course infuriated law enforcement. One might expect Mr. Najmrodzki to go quietly into the night, keeping out of trouble and maintaining a low profile to preserve his hard-earned freedom. But this was no ordinary man, and so he set his sights on an even more daring type of crime that used his professional training to its fullest advantage: stealing automobiles. Organizing a crack team of trusted accomplices, Mr. Najmrodzki began targeting various showrooms. He appeared to favor the FSO Polonaise, a common Eastern European auto comparable to the AMC Gremlin. The gang's method involved busting into the dealerships, then peeling off the seals on the back windows of the cars. Mr. Najmrodzki's knowledge of auto mechanics made hot wiring them a breeze, and within moments they'd be driving off in their prize. Equally important, though, was stealing templates of the requisite documents for ownership, acquired by breaking into public offices and city halls. The team also made sure to nab the stamps needed for authentication. Sometimes they'd sell the cars to the public, whereas other times they'd chop them up and sell just the parts. Mr. Najmrodzki wasn't without principle, though. His mantra was to steal only from, quote, smarts who made money off the harm of others, and, quote, cranky guys with a lot of cash. In other words, he was targeting the rich elites of the communist regime to give back to the little guy. The vehicles sold fabulously, owing to high demand and low prices. By 1982, Mr. Najmrodzki and his gang had already stolen over 100 cars. Being a vehicle aficionado himself, Mr. Najmrodzki never drove the Polonaise. He instead preferred Western autos like the Ford Granada and the occasional BMW. Once more, he was living the high life, leaving his wife for a busty 24-year-old whom he showered with lavish gifts. The two frequently vacationed in the northern lake region of Poland, and Mr. Najmrodzki even bought his lady friend a fine villa outside the nation's capital. All was going well for him. Mr. Najmrodzki had become something of a folk hero to the everyman. Of course, the government and media both had soured attitudes on him, colluding to smear him as a dangerous bandit. Yet he made a point of avoiding physical confrontation whenever possible. Mr. Najmrodzki kept the racket running for a good 3 years before authorities could catch up with him, who had dedicated an impressive amount of resources to do exactly that. For them, this was a point of pride. Mr. Najmrodzki's slippery escapes had made the regime look like fools, so no expense was spared to put him in his place. He was finally arrested in early 1984 while on the way back from one of his expensive trips. Mr. Najmrodzki couldn't resist the thrill of joyriding down the highway, but when he cruised past a park patrol officer, the chase was on. The Polish magazine Detective Extra speculated that he would have escaped the kilometers-long pursuit had it not been for a poorly timed flat tire. Yet even after bailing on his vehicle, Mr. Najmrodzki kept the chase going on foot, at one point stealing a bicycle to make his great escape. But this was ultimately futile. The police had eventually caught up with him, and only then did they realize who they had been chasing. None other than the government's most wanted fugitive, Zdzisław Najmrodzki. The Polish Houdini was locked up in the nation's capital, but he had no intention of making this a long stay. In February 1984, Mr. Najmrodzki was brought into the Warsaw Office of Internal Affairs for interrogation, for some reason left with but one inept guard. Mr. Najmrodzki waited for the right moment while the two were alone, then gave his captor a hard smack with both of his cuffed hands, knocking him out cold. He proceeded to take the officer's keys, jacket, and identification, freeing himself and literally walking out the front door flashing the stolen badge. The Ministry of Interior and Administration was outraged. Yet again, Poland's king of thieves had escaped their clutches. Needless to say, a full manhunt was put together to bring Zdzisław Najmrodzki to justice. It would take another 2 years to track down the daring escapee. In this time, it became popular for gamblers to bet on whether or not he'd be caught once more, and when. Mr. Najmrodzki was once again arrested after drunkenly driving a car into a tree. The legend goes that his attending nurses and physicians at the hospital asked for his autograph once they saw who they were treating. This time, he was sentenced to over 12 years behind bars for his transgressions. And to no one's surprise, he spent the next few years plotting yet another escape. By 1989, Mr. Najmrodzki was writing to his mother constantly, trying to hatch his most elaborate plan yet to secure his freedom. Sabina Najmrodzka bribed a local miner to dig out a tunnel from the basement of a nearby college to underneath the prison grounds, with the job taking about 3 months to complete. An unidentified individual working in the prison helped coordinate the location of the tunnel along one of the routes in the detention center's courtyard. Once Mr. Najmrodzki discovered the pit leading to his escape route, he took off at a moment's notice before anyone saw he was gone. Outside was a getaway motorcycle waiting for him, and he was once again on his way to freedom. As a final slap in the face to the correctional facility, it was discovered Mr. Najmrodzki had left a letter addressed to the prison warden, jokingly thanking him for his hospitality. Once again, he was up to his old tricks, stealing from Pevek stores and getting into all sorts of other mischief. And of course, it wasn't long before the police caught up to him. After imbibing a bit too much one November evening, he crashed a stolen car into a lamppost. When police caught up with him, he tried to play up his injuries and use a fake ID to get off, though a quick fingerprint check proved his true identity. Now, in addition to his previous charges, the court slapped on another 7 years as punishment for Mr. Najmrodzki's constant escapes. Both the capture and subsequent court case were a media circus. The authorities made a show of their increased security procedures, demonstrating an obsessive resolve in making sure Mr. Najmrodzki faced justice. Mr. Najmrodzki spoke at length to the Polish media of his capture and trial. All calls for clemency were decisively rejected. Defeated, but not yet finished, Mr. Najmrodzki tried making the best of his latest and most closely watched prison sentence. He attended rehabilitation classes and even wrote a book of poetry, which he managed to get published while he was behind bars. Meanwhile, the outside world was changing. communism had run its course, and the one-party Polish People's Republic was reorganized into a democracy now headed by former dissident Lech Wałęsa. In a bizarre twist of fate, President Wałęsa issued a full pardon to Zdzisław Najmrodzki in 1994, citing his commitment to rehabilitation while incarcerated. Unfortunately, Mr. Najmrodzki had a hard time becoming a law-abiding citizen. Within a year, he was back to stealing vehicles, driving carelessly through the Polish countryside. One such road trip ended rather gruesomely. After losing control of a stolen BMW in a rainstorm, Mr. Najmrodzki crashed into a truck on the other side of the road, instantly killing him and his two younger companions. A tragic, if not fitting end to Poland's favorite criminal. As our Polish translator observed, Mr. Najmrodzki was not the dangerous bandit he was made out to be, but rather an above-average crook whose criminal career and escape attempts showed how utterly incompetent the police were back then. The overkill security was but an attempt to make sure they didn't get laughed at for letting him escape again and again, unsuccessfully we might add. A number of documentaries, films, and even stage productions recounting Mr. Najmrodzki's life have come out over the years, keeping his legend alive. His mother still talks to the media occasionally, defending her son as but a rascal who found his own way to get under the skin of the unpopular communist regime. Having lost her 3 other sons as well, she laments the fact that despite his popularity with the ladies, he never produced any grandchildren. Indeed, there is something to be admired about the sheer audacity of Zdzisław Najmrodzki, despite the flaws that would ultimately be his undoing. Nowadays, he mostly remains obscure outside Poland, but to his supporters he continues to be championed as an underdog figure, who only ever took from those they believed deserved it anyways.